The iron cage stood 12 feet tall in the center of Devil's Junction, and inside it sat a woman who had supposedly torn her husband apart with her bare hands. They called her the Giant Widow, though her real name was Magdalena Thornwood, and for 6 months now, she'd been displayed like a circus animal, while the good people of Nevada threw rotten fruit at her face. But everything changed the moment she locked eyes with a scarred cowboy named Samuel Wilder, because in that single glance, two broken souls recognized something in each other that would shake the very foundations of that cruel little mining town. What happened next would prove that sometimes the most dangerous person isn't the one locked in a cage, but the one brave enough to see past the bars. Before we dive into the story, if you're watching this right now, wherever you are in the world, I want you to know you're about to witness one of the most powerful tales of love and redemption ever to come out of the American frontier. Click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another heart-stopping story like this one. And please, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love knowing that people from Tokyo to Tennessee, from midnight to morning, are all connected through these incredible human stories. Now, let's continue with the story. The dust hadn't settled from Sam Wilder's horse when he first saw her. Devil's Junction sprawled before him like a festering wound in the Nevada desert, all wooden buildings and broken dreams. But it was the spectacle in the town square that stopped him cold. The cage was built from railroad iron, thick bars that could hold a grizzly, and inside sat a woman unlike any he'd ever seen. She was massive, easily 6'4", with shoulders that stretched the fabric of her tattered dress, and hands that hung between her knees like weapons at rest. The townspeople had gathered for their daily entertainment, children throwing pebbles while their mothers gossiped about the monster who'd murdered Judge Thornwood with nothing but her cursed strength. But Sam saw what they refused to see. He saw the way she held her ribs when she breathed, the old bruises yellowing on her arms, the dignity she maintained despite the spit dripping from her hair. The burn scars covering the left side of his own face seemed to throb in sympathy. He'd planned to buy supplies and leave before sunset, but then Magdalena Thornwood raised her head and looked directly at him. Her eyes weren't the eyes of a monster. They were gray, like storm clouds, full of a grief so deep it could swallow mountains, and in them he saw his own reflection. Not the scarred drifter everyone else saw, but something more, something worth saving. The crowd jeered louder when she didn't flinch at a thrown tomato, but Sam noticed her lips move slightly, whispering something that looked like a prayer, or maybe a goodbye. He would learn later that she'd been saying goodbye every day for 6 months, waiting for death. She didn't know that death wasn't coming. Sam Wilder was. The Silver Dollar Saloon was thick with smoke and lies when Sam started asking questions about Magdalena Thornwood. Every man had a story about the Giant Widow, each tale more grotesque than the last, but it was the silence of the working girls that told him the real truth. They knew something these drunk miners and cowboys didn't want to admit. Sam bought whiskey for an old prospector named Eugene, whose tongue loosened after the third glass. Eugene had worked as a gravedigger for 20 years, and he'd seen what Judge Thornwood's first wife looked like in her coffin: broken jaw, shattered ribs, bruises that even death couldn't hide. The second wife had fled in the night, leaving everything behind, and Magdalena, wife number 3, had lasted the longest, 5 years of hell before that final night. The story came in fragments, like shards of a broken mirror. Judge Thornwood had been the law in Devil's Junction, owned half the mines and all the fear. He liked his women tall and strong because they took longer to break. The night Magdalena supposedly murdered him, 3 people had heard her screaming for help from inside their mansion. But when Sheriff Thornwood, the judge's younger brother, arrived, he found his brother dead and Magdalena covered in blood, a kitchen knife in her hand. Self-defense, she'd tried to say, but who would believe a woman who stood taller than most men? Who would take her word over the grief of a sheriff who'd just lost his brother? The trial had lasted 15 minutes. The sentence was death, but the sheriff had something crueler in mind. He wanted her to suffer like his brother had suffered, wanted the town to see her waste away slowly, publicly, shamefully, Sam's scarred hand tightened on his glass as Eugene whispered the worst part. There had been a witness. Little Tommy Thornwood, the sheriff's own son, had been hiding in the study that night. But a 7-year-old boy's testimony wasn't worth much when his father was running the trial. Now Tommy was 13, and he brought his mother's apple cores to throw at the cage every morning, though folks noticed he always seemed to miss. The saloon grew quiet when Sam stood to leave. They could see the decision forming in his eyes, the dangerous resolution of a man who'd been falsely accused himself. He knew what it felt like to have the truth twisted into a noose around your neck. Outside, the sun was setting, painting Devil's Junction in shades of blood and gold. Sam walked past the cage, where Magdalena sat motionless, her head bowed as if in prayer. But as he passed, he heard her voice, barely a whisper carried on the wind. She was reciting names. Mary Thornwood, Elizabeth Thornwood, and then other names, women from the town who'd disappeared over the years. She was keeping their memory alive, the only justice they'd ever receive. Sam made his decision then. He'd return after midnight when the town was drunk or asleep. He'd bring water, food, and something more precious than both. He'd bring the promise that someone finally believed her. Someone understood that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they wear judges' robes and leave their victims in cages, calling it justice. Midnight in Devil's Junction was a different world entirely. The saloon noise had died to whispers, and most folks had stumbled home to their beds, leaving the streets to shadows and secrets. Sam moved through the darkness like he belonged to it. A canteen of fresh water and cloth-wrapped bread hidden beneath his duster. The cage loomed before him, silver in the moonlight, and for a moment he wondered if Magdalena was even still alive. She sat so still, she could have been carved from stone. But when he whispered her name, her head lifted slowly, and those storm-gray eyes found his in the darkness. Her voice, when it finally came, was like sand over stone, rough from months of disuse. She tried to refuse the water at first, said she was past saving, that death would be a mercy now. But Sam pressed the canteen through the bars insistently, and when she finally drank, he saw tears mix with the dirt on her face. They talked in whispers, two ghosts sharing secrets in the Nevada night. She told him about the injury her husband had given her 3 years ago, a kick to her side that never properly healed, how she could feel something broken inside, slowly poisoning her blood. She'd been dying even before the cage, but at least in here, she couldn't hurt anyone when the fever dreams took her. Sam wanted to reach through the bars and shake her, make her understand she was the victim, not the monster, but instead, he told her his own story. He spoke of the fire that had taken the Baker family, all 5 of them, including the baby, and how the town had decided he'd set it for the insurance money, never mind that he'd been working for the Bakers, not owning their property. He showed her the scars that covered half his face and ran down his neck, souvenirs from trying to save them, from running into those flames 3 times before the roof collapsed. The lynch mob had already picked out a tree when a traveling judge reviewed the evidence and found him innocent. But innocent didn't mean welcome, and he'd been drifting ever since. 5 years of towns that looked at his scars and saw guilt anyway. When he finished, Magdalena reached through the bars, her massive hand gentle as a mother's as she touched the ruined side of his face. The moment shattered when boot steps echoed off the wooden sidewalks. Sheriff Thornwood's deputies were making their rounds, and one of them was headed straight for the cage. Sam had seconds to decide whether to run or fight, but Magdalena made the choice for him. She grabbed his coat and yanked him against the bars, then began moaning loudly, theatrically, like she was having some kind of fit. The deputy laughed, thinking the giant widow was finally breaking, and didn't notice Sam pressed flat against the far side of the cage in the shadows. After the deputy left, still chuckling about the crazy woman, Magdalena released Sam. Her hand lingered on his chest for just a moment, feeling his heartbeat race beneath her palm. She whispered that he shouldn't come back, that the sheriff was getting meaner as hanging day approached. But Sam caught her hand before she could pull it back through the bars. He promised he'd return, promised he'd find a way to get her out. She laughed then, bitter and beautiful, and told him heroes didn't exist in Devil's Junction. They were killed or caged or run out of town. But Sam wasn't trying to be a hero. He was just a scarred man who recognized another survivor when he saw one. And sometimes, recognition was the first step toward redemption. Clara Winsong lived at the edge of town, where the desert reclaimed the mistakes of men, her small adobe home surrounded by herbs that grew despite the drought. Half Shoshone and all unwelcome, she survived because even bigots needed healing when their bones broke or their wives struggled in childbirth. Sam found her grinding sage in the pre-dawn darkness, and she didn't seem surprised to see him. She'd been watching him watch the cage, she said, and anyone who looked at Magdalena with compassion instead of fear was worth a conversation. When Sam mentioned Magdalena's internal injury, Clara's weathered face darkened. She tried to examine her months ago, but the sheriff had forbidden it, said the giant widow didn't deserve comfort. But Clara owed Magdalena a debt that went deeper than the sheriff's threats. She poured Sam bitter coffee and told him about the night 3 years ago when Judge Thornwood had cornered her 14-year-old daughter, Rose, behind the schoolhouse. Magdalena had appeared like an avenging angel, all 6 feet 4 inches of her, and had thrown the judge into the mud so hard he couldn't walk straight for a week. She'd paid for it later, Clara knew, had seen the bruises when Magdalena came seeking herbs for pain. But she'd never named her husband as the cause, just paid for the medicine and protected Rose every time she saw her in town. Now, Rose was safe in California with Clara's sister, but the debt remained. Clara would help, but they'd need to be smarter than their anger. The plan she proposed was audacious in its simplicity. If they couldn't break Magdalena out by force, they'd remove her through medicine. Clara would declare a fever outbreak, something contagious enough to require quarantine. The old Spanish mission 2 miles outside town had been converted to a pest house during the last cholera scare. If Clara could convince the sheriff that Magdalena was infected and could spread disease through the town, he might agree to move her there for isolation. But first, Sam would need to gain the sheriff's trust, become useful to him, become someone whose word carried weight. It meant joining the very men who'd caged Magdalena, wearing a deputy's badge while planning treason. Sam's jaw clenched at the thought, but Clara grabbed his scarred hand with surprising strength. She told him that sometimes the only way to fight monsters was to walk among them, learn their weaknesses, their fears. The sheriff had been losing control lately, she'd noticed. Too many drinks, too many violent outbursts. His own men were starting to fear him more than respect him. If Sam could position himself as the steady hand, the reliable gun, he might get close enough to matter. And there was something else Clara had noticed. Young Tommy Thornwood had been stealing medical supplies from her shop. Nothing major, just bandages and healing salve. The boy was hiding something, and secrets in a small town were like cracks in a dam. Eventually, they'd break everything wide open. The sun was rising as Sam left Clara's home with a packet of herbs to help him sleep without dreams and a plan that could get them all killed. He'd need to become someone else entirely, a man who could hunt outlaws and drink with murderers, all while the woman in the cage grew weaker each day. Clara had given him 2 weeks at most before Magdalena's injury turned fatal. 2 weeks to infiltrate the sheriff's inner circle, gain his trust, and orchestrate a rescue that wouldn't end with them all swinging from the same tree. As he walked back toward town, Sam touched the scars on his face and made peace with becoming a devil to save an angel. The Gonzalez brothers had been terrorizing the mining camps for months, and Sam brought them in draped over their saddles after tracking them through the desert for 3 days. Sheriff Thornwood was impressed despite himself, especially since his own deputies had failed to find even their tracks. Sam played the part perfectly, the drifter looking for steady work, scarred face making him look dangerous enough to be useful. Within a week, he wore a deputy's star and drank whiskey with men who laughed about the giant widow's deteriorating condition. Each toast he raised burned his throat like swallowing coals, but he smiled and called for another round. Trust was built on shared sins, and Sam was becoming fluent in damnation. The celebration at the Silver Dollar that night was wilder than usual. The sheriff, drunk on whiskey and success, announced that justice would finally be served. In 3 days, on Sunday morning after church, they'd hang Magdalena Thornwood in front of the whole God-fearing town. The men cheered, but Sam noticed Tommy Thornwood sitting in the corner, his young face pale as death. The boy slipped out during the revelry, and Sam followed at a distance, watching him head straight for the cage. By the time Sam reached the square, Tommy was already there, pressing something through the bars to Magdalena. Food, Sam realized. Good food from the sheriff's own table. The boy had been feeding her in secret. Small acts of rebellion that could get him beaten, or worse. Sam waited until Tommy left before approaching the cage himself. Magdalena was trying to eat the bread the boy had brought, but her hands shook too badly to hold it. Sam reached through the bars and steadied her hands with his own, their fingers intertwining around the meager meal. She looked at him with those storm-gray eyes, seeing through his deputy's badge to the man beneath. She whispered that he should leave town tonight, that she'd heard what the sheriff had planned. But Sam pressed closer to the bars, telling her about Clara's plan, about the fake outbreak that would get her to the mission. 3 days wasn't long, but it might be enough. Magdalena shook her head, said she was too weak now, that moving her would kill her faster than hanging. That's when something broke inside Sam, something that had been holding him back from the truth. He told her he'd rather watch her die free than let them make a spectacle of her death. He told her about the dreams where he saved the Baker family, where he was fast enough, strong enough, brave enough to pull them all from the flames. He couldn't save them, but he could save her, would save her, even if it meant burning Devil's Junction to the ground. Magdalena's hand found his face through the bars, her thumb tracing the scars that marked him as a survivor. Then she did something that stopped his heart. She pulled him against the bars and kissed him, fierce and desperate and alive, like she was pouring all her remaining strength into this one moment of connection. Neither of them saw Tommy Thornwood standing in the shadows, watching with wide eyes as the woman his father called a monster kissed the scarred deputy like he was her last prayer. The boy's world was reshaping itself in that moment. Everything he'd been told about good and evil, justice and crime, shifting like sand dunes in a storm. When Sam finally pulled away from the bars, Magdalena whispered something that would haunt him. She said she wasn't afraid of dying anymore, because she'd finally been seen, truly seen, by someone who understood that sometimes the real crime was surviving what should have killed you. Sam left with her kiss still burning on his lips, and Tommy Thornwood's conflicted gaze burning into his back. Tommy Thornwood appeared at the cage just after dawn, when the town was still sleeping off Saturday night's sins. His hands trembled as he produced a key from his pocket, not to free Magdalena, but to unlock the small maintenance gate that allowed someone to clean the cage floor. He crawled inside with her, this 13-year-old boy carrying the weight of a terrible secret. Magdalena tried to warn him away, but Tommy's words came pouring out like water breaking through a dam. He'd been there that night, had seen everything from behind the study curtains. His uncle, Judge Thornwood, had been strangling Magdalena with his belt when she'd finally fought back, grabbing the letter opener from his desk in desperate self-defense. But what came next was worse. His father, the sheriff, had arrived to find his brother dying, and Tommy had watched his father press the kitchen knife into Magdalena's hand, watched him stage the scene to look like murder instead of survival. The revelation hung between them like a physical thing, heavy and sharp-edged. Magdalena's face crumpled as she realized she'd been protecting her would-be executioner's son all this time, keeping silent about Tommy's witness to protect him from his father's wrath. The boy sobbed against her shoulder, this giant woman the town feared holding him like the mother he'd lost to cholera 3 years prior. He told her how his father had changed after his mother's death, how the grief had turned to rage, how he'd helped his brother cover up the bruises on his wives because family protected family, even when family was wrong. But watching Magdalena suffer for 6 months, watching her dignity in the face of such cruelty, had slowly awakened something his mother had planted in him before she died. Conscience, she'd called it. The voice that tells you right from wrong, even when the whole world is shouting the opposite. Tommy pulled back and showed Magdalena what he'd really come to give her. Not just food this time, but a ring of keys he'd stolen from his father's office. One of them opened her cage, another the chains that bound her ankles. He was choosing her life over his father's lies, choosing truth over blood. But they both knew that using those keys now would mean death for everyone involved. The sheriff would hunt them down, and the town would help. They needed Sam's plan, Clara's medical ruse, something that would get Magdalena away from the immediate danger before the truth could be revealed. Tommy promised to testify, to tell everyone what he'd seen. But first, she had to survive long enough for his words to matter. Sam arrived at the cage as Tommy was leaving, and the boy stopped him with a hand on his scarred arm. He pressed the keys into Sam's palm and whispered that his mother would have liked him, would have said his scars were proof that he'd tried to save people, not hurt them. Then Tommy did something that would change everything. He told Sam that his father kept documents in a locked drawer, documents that proved Judge Thornwood had killed his first 2 wives and 3 other women who'd refused his advances. The sheriff had helped cover it up each time, calling the deaths accidents or suicides. If Sam could get those papers, they'd have enough evidence to bring in federal marshals. But the sheriff was growing suspicious, had noticed Sam's attention to the cage, noticed his son's strange behavior. Time was running out faster than any of them realized. Clara arrived at the cage that afternoon, making a show of examining Magdalena from outside the bars, then declaring loudly that the prisoner was showing signs of typhoid fever. The crowd that had gathered for their daily entertainment scattered like startled birds. Nobody wanted to catch typhoid, especially not from the giant widow. The sheriff was furious, but also terrified. His own mother had died from typhoid, and the fear of it was bone deep. By sunset, he'd agreed to move Magdalena to the old mission for quarantine, but only if Sam personally guaranteed she wouldn't escape. It was happening, their desperate plan finally in motion, but none of them knew that Sheriff Thornwood had already decided that Sam needed to die. The old mission sat against the red rocks like a forgotten prayer, its adobe walls crumbling but still strong enough to hold secrets. They moved Magdalena there at dusk, the sheriff insisting she be chained even on what he assumed was her deathbed. Clara had done her work well, painting Magdalena's skin with herb mixtures that mimicked fever sweats, teaching her to shake and moan convincingly. The townspeople watched from a distance as the wagon carried the giant widow away, some making the sign of the cross, others spitting in the dirt. Sam rode alongside, his deputy's badge feeling heavier than iron chains. Sheriff Thornwood's eyes never left him, suspicious and calculating, already planning something dark. Inside the mission, once the sheriff and his men had left them to their supposed death watch, Clara worked with desperate efficiency. The act had taken everything from Magdalena, and now she collapsed for real, her body finally surrendering to months of starvation and that old internal injury. Clara's hands moved over her abdomen, feeling the swelling that shouldn't be there, the heat that radiated from deep inside. Peritonitis, she diagnosed grimly, from where Judge Thornwood's boot had ruptured something 3 years ago. It had been killing her slowly, and the cage had accelerated the process. They had maybe days, not weeks. Sam held Magdalena's head in his lap, while Clara mixed medicines the church would have called witchcraft, old Shoshone remedies that might buy them time. Through the night, Magdalena drifted in and out of consciousness, and in her delirium, she told them things. She spoke of her childhood in Oregon, growing taller than all the boys, stronger than most men, how her parents had sold her to Judge Thornwood like livestock because no one else would marry a giant. She talked about the other women, the ones who'd disappeared, how she'd tried to warn them, but they'd seen her size and assumed she was the danger. She called for Sam repeatedly, and he held her massive hand in both of his, whispering promises he wasn't sure he could keep. He told her about the ranch he'd dreamed of building, somewhere in Montana where no one knew their names or their scars. Clara watched them with sad eyes, knowing that love born in such desperate circumstances rarely survived the harsh light of freedom. Just before dawn, Magdalena's fever broke for real. Her gray eyes cleared, and she saw Sam's exhausted face above her, saw the tears he didn't know were falling. She reached up and touched his scars again, told him he was beautiful, that his face was a map of every good thing he'd tried to do. They kissed again, softer this time, like they had all the time in the world instead of hours. That's when Tommy burst through the mission door, his face white with panic. His father was coming with 20 men, had discovered the stolen keys, the missing documents. He declared Sam a traitor and Magdalena a witch who'd enchanted his deputy. They were coming to burn the mission with everyone inside. Clara grabbed her medical bag and Tommy's arm, ready to flee. But Magdalena struggled to sit up, something fierce returning to her eyes. She wasn't going to die lying down, wasn't going to let them burn this place like they'd burned so many women before. She asked Sam for his gun, and when he hesitated, she laughed. That bitter, beautiful sound. She wasn't planning to kill anyone, she said. Just wanted to stand like a human being when they came for her. Sam understood then that this was her choosing how to die, and that was its own kind of freedom. He helped her to her feet, all 6 feet 4 inches of her, weakened but unbroken. Through the mission window, they could see the torches approaching like fallen stars, and Sheriff Thornwood riding at the front, his face twisted with the same rage that had lived in his brother. The mission doors splintered under the sheriff's boot just as the sun crested the hills, painting everything in shades of blood and gold. Sam stood in front of Magdalena, his gun drawn but pointed at the ground, while Clara shielded Tommy with her own body. Sheriff Thornwood's face was a mask of betrayal and fury, but it was the mob behind him that made Sam's blood run cold. These weren't just deputies anymore. He'd roused the whole town, told them the giant widow was a witch who'd corrupted his own son and deputy. They carried torches and wrote righteousness and murder in their eyes. The sheriff raised his pistol, aimed directly at Sam's head, and said that traitors died first. But before he could pull the trigger, Tommy stepped forward from behind Clara, his young voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. The boy told them everything, his words clear despite his shaking hands. He told them about that night, about watching his uncle strangle Magdalena, about seeing his father plant evidence to frame her. The crowd stirred uneasily, but the sheriff laughed, called his son confused, bewitched like the rest. That's when Tommy produced something that stopped everyone cold. His mother's diary, hidden in the same locked drawer as the other documents. In it, she documented every bruise she'd seen on the judge's wives, every woman who'd come to her crying, every time she'd begged her husband to stop protecting his brother. Her final entry, written the day before she died, said she feared her husband might kill her for knowing too much. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Maybe the cholera hadn't taken Mrs. Thornwood after all. The crowd's loyalty began to crack like thin ice. These people had loved Mrs. Thornwood, remembered her kindness, her gentleness. Some of the women started crying, remembering their own fears, their own bruises hidden beneath Sunday dresses. Old Eugene, the gravedigger, stepped forward and confirmed he'd always wondered about the cholera story, how Mrs. Thornwood had been healthy one day and dead the next. Others began to speak up, small voices becoming a chorus of doubt. The sheriff's deputies looked at each other uncertainly, their guns wavering. That's when Magdalena did something extraordinary. Despite her weakness, despite barely being able to stand, she walked forward past Sam, past his protecting arm, and faced the town that had tortured her. She didn't speak of her own suffering. Instead, she named them. Mary Thornwood, Elizabeth Thornwood, Sarah Mills, Catherine, Rodriguez, Jane Patterson. All the women who'd died mysteriously, who'd disappeared, who'd been silenced. She'd kept their names alive in that cage, reciting them like prayers, and now she gave them back to the town that had forgotten them. With each name, another person in the crowd lowered their weapon. Some fell to their knees. The sheriff's face had gone from red to white, his gun handshaking as he realized his kingdom of fear was crumbling. In desperation, he swung his pistol toward his own son, screaming that Tommy was a liar, a betrayer, that family was supposed to protect family. Sam moved faster than he had since the night of the fire, throwing himself between the sheriff and Tommy just as the gun fired. The bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around, but Magdalena was already moving. 6 months in a cage hadn't completely broken her strength. She grabbed the sheriff's wrist and twisted, the gun falling to the mission floor. He pulled a hidden knife from his boot, slashing at her, but she held on even as the blade cut deep into her arm. They struggled, this giant woman and this small, vicious man, while the crowd watched in stunned silence. Then Sheriff Thornwood made his final mistake. He called her the same names his brother had used, the same words that had preceded every beating. Something ancient and unbreakable rose up in Magdalena, and with the last of her strength, she lifted him off the ground and threw him through the mission window. He landed in the dirt outside, unconscious but breathing, finally defeated by the woman he'd tried to destroy. The mission floor was slick with blood, Sam's and Magdalena's mixing together as Clara worked frantically to keep them both alive. The crowd had dispersed in shock and shame, some to pray, others to drink themselves into forgetting what they'd been part of. A few good men had stayed to help, carrying the unconscious sheriff to the jail he'd once ruled. The irony not lost on anyone. Tommy knelt beside Magdalena, holding her hand while Clara stitched the deep gash in her arm, the boy finally able to be the son his mother would have wanted. But it was Sam's wound that worried Clara most. The bullet had lodged near his lung, and she didn't have the tools or skill to remove it safely. He needed a real doctor, not a half-Shoshone healer working with herbs and prayers. Magdalena crawled to where Sam lay despite Clara's protests, her own pain forgotten as she cradled his head in her lap. She whispered to him about Montana, about the ranch with horses and endless sky, about mornings where they'd wake up without fear. Sam's scarred hand found hers, and he told her to stop talking like he was dying, that he'd survived worse than one bullet from a coward. But they both knew he was lying. His breathing was getting shallow, pink foam at the corners of his mouth. Magdalena did something then that broke everyone watching. She began to sing, a lullaby her mother had sung before selling her away. Her voice cracked but beautiful, filling the mission with something that sounded like hope and heartbreak combined. That's when the miracle arrived in the form of thundering hoofbeats. Federal Marshal James Crawford rode up with 6 men, badges gleaming in the morning Sunday. Clara's letters had reached them after all, sent weeks ago when she'd first suspected the truth about the Thornwood brothers. The marshal took one look at the scene, at the blood and the boy with his mother's diary, at the wounded woman who'd been caged for 6 months, and began barking orders. His men had brought a military surgeon who'd been traveling with them, investigating reports of corruption in the mining territories. The surgeon went to work on Sam immediately, his skilled hands doing what Clara couldn't, extracting the bullet while Magdalena held Sam's hand and refused to let go. While the surgeon worked, Marshal Crawford began his investigation. The whole town seemed eager to confess now, as if 6 months of collective guilt had finally become too heavy to bear. They told him about the cage, about the daily humiliations, about how they'd known something was wrong but had been too afraid of the Thornwood brothers to speak up. The women especially came forward, sharing stories they'd kept hidden for years, bruises they'd explained away, friends who'd vanished. By noon, Crawford had enough testimony to hang Sheriff Thornwood 3 times over, though he'd settle for a life sentence in territorial prison. The judge would get his justice posthumously, recorded in history as the monster he'd been rather than the lawman he'd pretended to be. Magdalena never left Sam's side as he fought through fever and infection for 3 days. She spoke to him constantly, her voice the thread that kept him tethered to life. She told him about her real name, not Magdalena but Margaret, how Judge Thornwood had renamed her, something he thought sounded more exotic, more like property than a person. She told him about the first time she'd seen him, how his scars had made her feel less alone, how he'd looked at her like a person when everyone else saw a monster. Clara kept working on them both, that internal injury in Magdalena still threatening to claim her even as the external wounds healed. On the 3rd night, when Sam's fever finally broke and his eyes opened clear and focused, Magdalena collapsed. Clara caught her before she hit the floor, and Sam tried to rise despite his bandages, both of them reaching for each other across the space between life and death. 3 months had passed since the morning at the mission, and the desert was blooming with unexpected life after unseasonable rains. Margaret, no longer Magdalena, no longer the giant widow, sat on the porch of Clara's homestead, her body transformed by both suffering and healing. The months of starvation had taken inches from her height and pounds from her frame, leaving her still tall but no longer imposing. The peritonitis that should have killed her had responded to Clara's medicines and the surgeon's interventions, though it had been close, so close that Sam had spent 2 weeks sleeping on the floor beside her bed, afraid she'd slip away if he wasn't watching. Now she could stand without pain, walk without chains, exist without fear, though sometimes she still woke expecting to feel iron bars. Sam's shoulder had healed, crooked but functional, another scar to add to his collection, though this one he wore with pride. It was proof he'd stood between evil and innocence, between a father's rage and a son's courage. Tommy lived with them now, the boy having nowhere else to go after testifying against his father. Sheriff Thornwood would spend the rest of his life breaking rocks in territorial prison, and Tommy had chosen to break the cycle of violence instead of continuing it. He'd grown 3 inches and learned to laugh again, helping Sam with the horses they'd started breaking for sale, finding the father he'd always needed in a scarred drifter who'd chosen courage over comfort. The wedding was small, just Clara as witness and Tommy as Sam's best man, held in the shade of a massive cottonwood tree where the sage grew wild and purple. Margaret wore a simple dress that Clara had sewn, nothing fancy, but it fit her changed body perfectly and didn't hide her scars. Sam's hand shook as he placed the ring on her finger, not from fear, but from the overwhelming realization that they'd both survived their separate hells to find each other. When they kissed, it wasn't desperate or fierce like those moments at the cage, but soft and certain, like they finally had time to learn each other without death breathing down their necks. Clara cried happy tears while Tommy whooped and threw his hat in the air. This makeshift family born from tragedy but held together by choice. They left for Montana the next morning, their wagon loaded with supplies and hope. Clara had given them medicines and her blessing, making them promise to write. Tommy rode ahead on his own horse, already planning where he'd build his own cabin on their land someday. As Devil's Junction disappeared behind them, Margaret reached for Sam's hand, their fingers intertwining like they had through iron bars, but freely now, without impediment. She told him she'd never be the giant anyone feared again, that the cage had made her smaller in body but larger in spirit. Sam lifted their joined hands and kissed her knuckles, each one, reverently. He told her she'd never been a giant to him, just a woman who'd needed someone to see her truth. The Montana Territory stretched before them like an answered prayer, mountains touching sky, valleys full of grass that whispered in the wind. They found their place where a creek sang through a meadow, where wild horses ran free, where no one knew their names or their stories. Margaret and Sam built their ranch with their own hands, Tommy helping every step, and slowly they became what they'd always been meant to be. Not broken things, not monsters or victims, but weathered souls who'd found home in each other. Some nights, Margaret would still whisper the names of the women who hadn't survived, keeping their memory alive. But now, she'd add her own name to the list, Margaret Wilder, survivor, wife, and finally, free. The sage grew wild around their cabin, purple and fragrant, and every morning Sam would pick a sprig for her hair, a reminder that beautiful things could grow even in the harshest ground. That's the end of our story, friends. And if it touched your heart, if it made you believe in second chances and the power of truth, please click the like button and subscribe to this channel. Tomorrow, I'll have another incredible tale of human resilience and unexpected love. Until then, remember that sometimes the strongest people are the ones who've been broken and chose to heal. And sometimes love finds us in the most impossible places, even through iron bars.